my presentation is called United States Divided People. It talks about how our country has been politically divided, especially during the past decade. Today, there are two contemporary parties within the United States. The Republican Party, which is on the right side of the political spectrum, and the Democratic Party, which is on the left. So, first, there's the political spectrum. This was developed about a century ago as more and more political ideologies began to come around, especially towards the end of the 19th century. Where you stand on the political spectrum depends on your beliefs. The left might believe that people are inherently good and that society makes them troubled, therefore society will eventually end and must support the individual. The right might say that society helps troubled people and without it there might be chaos. Now and then, how much government control depends on whether you're authoritarian or libertarian. So the conservative right, the extreme end of that is the reactionary. They defend traditional values. They had it right back then, and we just need to go back to that. Is what something you might hear on that side. So, for an example, is we need to go back to, like, say, the 50s, where everything was good, everything was fine, or something like that. They believe in free market economies, so generally they're capitalist. And then, so policies that they generally support, especially today, is a limited government control and intervention, especially in the economy. They're often pro-life, and they advocate for gun rights and are often against free healthcare. And then there's the socialist left. Their extremist view is generally deemed to be radical. They look towards command economies, which is different from capitalist economies, and currently looks for social reform. They might say we need to change the current and outdated system of repression, which is something you'll often hear from the left. Policies that would gain their support are free healthcare, civil rights, LGBT, and environmental protection. I would like to point out that a lot of people don't have a belief in something along the lines of either of these. So these parties used to work together, and it used to be working on a lot of bipartisan issues. So what happened during the last couple of years? How did we go from Eisenhower and JFK to extremes such as Trump and Biden? So what happened was the platforms changed. The Republican Party doubled down on traditional values, cementing their status as the conservative party. And then, however, this has changed in the past decade and has since led to a new Republican Party. The Democrats reacted and then changed their own platform to advocate for social justice, with their counterparts moving to such extremes, so as they started to move apart. So, in this slide, it covers how the GOP has changed under the Trump White House. NPR documented how exactly it changed. They said, the reporter is Gonya, quote, a lot of things long-held GOP beliefs have been jettisoned under Trump. The party of free trade has stood by Trump as he criticized trade deals and poses tariffs. Another topic, immigration. President George W. Bush pressed for immigration reforms by highlighting the humanity of those crossing the border illegally. Now Trump, and he ends up quoting Trump saying they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And then here's a video from Vox Media that details how exactly Trump has gained so much support in the last couple of years and how exactly that might change the Republican Party.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
The 2016 Republican presidential nominee disregards the norms of adult behavior. He disregards the norms of American democracy as we know it.
It should be heartbreaking to every American that we have a front runner that suggests there will be a religious test for anybody who wishes to come to our shores.
He's so unusual, his rhetoric at times so extreme, that political experts and commentators were blindsided by his rise.
You better be ready for the fact that you might be leading the Republican ticket next time.
I know you don't believe that, but I want to go on.
How did Donald Trump attract such broad support within the Republican Party? And what does it mean for the U.S. beyond this election?
And it turns out that this is a question that can be answered to a really surprising extent via this niche field of political science. It developed a theory about what's called authoritarianism.
We're not talking about dictatorships. Authoritarianism is a term political scientists use for a worldview that values order and authority and distrusts outsiders and social change. And when authoritarians feel threatened, they look for strongman leaders.
Leaders who are punitive, who target outgroups, and who have a simple, forceful leadership style that makes them feel strong. And if you were going to grow that candidate in a lab,
I'm gonna bomb the shit out of them.
he would look a lot like Donald Trump.
When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their family. They care about their lives, don't kid yourself. When they say they don't care about their lives, you have to take out their family.
Authoritarianism is not in and of itself necessarily a partisan issue.
For most of this country's history, authoritarians were likely divided between the two parties. But now, only one of the parties really appeals to them.
What happened was the Republican Party started to embrace what it referred to as traditional values, and it stood against a series of major social changes in this country.
After initially supporting civil rights, Republicans began courting Southern white voters who opposed racial integration. They turned against the Equal Rights Amendment, denounced abortion, and later fought against same-sex marriage.
Our nation must enact a constitution to protect marriage in America.
More recently, foreign threats like terrorism have become major political issues, with Republicans taking positions that align with authoritarian fears and preferences.
So Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler, two political scientists, they tracked data over several decades, and they found that authoritarian voters were shifting into the Republican Party. So that means that when authoritarians become scared, when they become activated by a particular social change or issue, the Republican Party can't ignore them, and they are a ready-made constituency for a candidate like Donald Trump.
Are you going to have a massive deportation force?
You're going to have a deportation force. I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
Testing people for authoritarianism is a bit tricky.
You can't necessarily just ask people, are you really freaked out by social change? Do racial differences unsettle you? Do you support strongman leaders? Because those are very sensitive questions, and people won't necessarily answer them honestly.
So instead, political scientists ask people about something more neutral, their parenting preferences.
Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have: independence or respect for elders, obedience or self-reliance.
These questions seem like they're about raising children, but really what they're asking people is how much they value order and authority.
So when political scientists tested these four parenting questions against the behaviors that they knew authoritarians exhibited, they found out that the correlation was very close. It was very predictive, at least for white voters.
Using this four-question test, Vox worked with Morning Consult in February 2016 to poll a large sample of likely voters.
Our results yielded a few really interesting things. The first one was that yes, scoring high on the authoritarianism questions was very predictive of support for Trump.
A political science student named Matthew McWilliams has found similar results.
He's done two polls, both of which have found that authoritarianism is not only strongly predictive of Trump support, but that it seems to do a better job of predicting it than virtually any other factor.
We also looked at what authoritarian voters are afraid of.
On things like car accidents, or the risk of gun violence, or prescription drugs, there wasn't a huge difference between authoritarians and non-authoritarians. But when it came to threats associated with people, and particularly foreign people, authoritarians were much more afraid.
And we identified policies that authoritarians were more likely to support.
So authoritarians were much more likely to say, for instance, that the United States should use force rather than diplomacy when dealing with countries that threaten our interests overseas. And they were much more likely to want to sacrifice civil liberties in exchange for safety.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay. I want surveillance.
It's a set of priorities that doesn't always align with the Republican establishment.
They don't seem to have that much interest in small government, and they definitely don't seem particularly interested in shrinking entitlements like Social Security or Medicaid.
This theory doesn't fully explain the Trump phenomenon. Researchers will probably study this election for decades. But what it tells us is that he's benefited from a larger shift in this country, one that goes beyond any one candidate.
Trump isn't just a fluke. He's not somebody who's just doing well because he had name recognition or was a famous TV star. This is a large group of people. They want these things, and they're going to be looking for politicians who can give it to them. And
All right, so that covers the Republican Party, and then there's the Democratic Party, which has also been changing, especially since Trump took the White House. One example is in the case of Bernie Sanders. In the early 2000s, he was considered largely a smear on the Democratic Party. Not many people actually liked to listen to him. He was a small-time senator. No one really paid attention to him because he was only from Vermont. However, over the course of the coming decade, he would gain popularity. And especially in 2016 and recently in the 2020 election, he was a Democratic frontrunner. And he was the last person to drop out before Joe Biden took the Democratic ticket. So in The Atlantic, I'm going to quote them here, the most prominent socialist in America, Sanders, has gained a following, and in 2016, he challenged Hillary Clinton for the presidential nomination. He eventually lost, of course, but not before winning roughly 13 million votes in 23 primaries and caucuses against Hillary Clinton, who won 17 million and won 34. On every front, the Democratic Party is moving left, and the power of the left can be seen in the fact that even Democrats who oppose some of these policies are wary of attacking them. When it comes to challenging the progressive ring, Democratic candidates act as if they were walking on eggshells. And this is and then I could also point out that in 2018 there was another election, the midterm election, and because of that, a large number of young Democrats actually took their seats in the House of Representatives. It was the largest freshman class of House of Representatives in a long time. And among these candidates was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, along with a bunch of other House Democrats. And with that came a lot more divide and socialist ideals. She does call herself a democratic socialist with Sanders, and is largely the most popular person in the House of Representatives for the left. Now, this is a political cartoon made by USA Today. And it depicts Ocasio-Cortez talking about systemic priorities and how they're wrong and how they have to reorganize everything from the bottom up. And it depicts her as a puppet by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, if you don't know who he is he's effectively the father of socialism. It was published in his Communist Manifesto. And he has been largely considered the cause of socialists and communism. And the right believes that these ideals are too far left and that they are too extreme. So as the Republican Party goes right, the Democratic Party begins to keep going left. So is there a solution? If there's a solution, it's to rely on what the Founding Fathers gave us to elect new officials, not based on politics, but also what they believe in, whether they be Democrat or Republican. I also think that we should elect officials that have open conversations with those we don't agree with, though it may be trying very hard to be patient with. It's only this way that we can change our minds on certain issues and find common ground. I would like to point out that, like I said, the Republican Party was initially for civil rights. They were the party that advocated for ending slavery. They were Abraham Lincoln's party. And then over time, things changed. They became the party of business and laissez-faire economics, which is largely how they affect the economy today. And then the Democratic Party also used to be the party for the common man, but that common man was only white men. And eventually, they began to split, especially during the early half of the 20th century, where candidates such as Truman and Roosevelt began to change how the Democratic Party started to look at certain issues, including civil rights and social justice. And then eventually, the Southern Democrats, which were called Dixiecrats, who supported segregation, among other things, eventually they did go to the Republican Party, especially during the time of Richard Nixon, after Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, signed the Civil Rights Bill. So things have largely changed, especially during the last century, and then during the last administration, as things continue to split apart. Any questions?
Don't forget, we got to ask some questions throughout the course of the presentation together, just to do a quick refresher on that. Can I ask first?
Of course.
All right. Are we talking about political divides between parties? We're thinking about opposition between parties. You frame the question in exactly what we're seeking to answer.
What?
With your topic, are we talking about how to solve the divide between parties, or how to integrate parties into, like, no political parties? You understand?
I would say to solve the divide between them. I wouldn't say to end political parties at any point. I don't think that's feasible in any way. At this point, I don't think there's a way that could be feasible. Is it what I would like it to be like that? I'm not sure. I never really thought about it that way.
Okay. Other questions?
What are some other solutions that you found out?
Some other solutions? Other solutions include just relying on the Constitution and throwing out people who we believe are not right for the government. But that doesn't always work. And eventually it just comes down to whether you support that person in office, because at the bottom line is that we support whoever is in office. If we don't support them, then they have to go out. It's just how it works.